Part 1. Origins, Shadows, and the Birth of America's Hidden Hand. There are stories we are allowed to hear. Stories printed in history books, repeated in classrooms, and spoken by public officials. And then, there are the stories that never reach the surface. Stories funded by money that does not appear on any government ledger. Hidden operations, secret alliances, and agendas carried out in the dark, all under the authority of three letters that shape the invisible world: the CIA. For decades, the Central Intelligence Agency has been portrayed as the shield of American democracy, an intelligence service dedicated to defending freedom. But behind the official mission, beyond the patriotic speeches and Hollywood depictions, lies a deeper, more complex reality. A reality funded by what is known as the black budget. This budget does not pass through normal democratic oversight. It is concealed behind layers of classified appropriations, private shell companies, foreign banking networks, defense contractors, and intelligence alliances that stretch across the globe. And the power it provides has shaped wars, governments, revolutions, and the personal freedoms of millions of people, often without their knowledge. To understand how the black budget came to exist, we must begin at a time when the world was fractured, fearful, and desperate for a new form of power. The year is 1945. The Second World War has just ended. Europe lies in ruins. Millions are dead. Entire cities are reduced to ash. The world is exhausted, physically, psychologically, and spiritually. But beneath the rubble, something else is rising. A new conflict. A conflict without open battlefields, without flags, without declared war. A conflict that will be waged in laboratories, back alleys, corporate boardrooms, and secret military bases. The Cold War. And in the early days of that conflict, American leadership made a fateful decision. If it wanted to survive, if it wanted to control the future, it needed to control information. In other words, it needed a new kind of soldier. Not a soldier of muscle, but a soldier of secrecy. Not a soldier trained to charge forward, but one trained to operate in silence, anonymously, and without public accountability. This idea led to the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947 through the National Security Act signed by President Harry Truman. Publicly, the CIA was tasked with collecting intelligence to protect the nation. Privately, its purpose was far more expansive. Within weeks of its formation, a second layer of operations began. Covert action programs designed to influence foreign governments, shape global opinion, dismantle rival powers, and ensure American dominance in the emerging post-war world. But covert action costs money. A vast amount of money. Money that would be impossible to justify before Congress or the American public. This is where the black budget enters history. The concept was simple: create financial channels that no one could trace. Redirect funds from military appropriations, foreign aid programs, and national security spending, hide them behind layers of secrecy, and use those funds to shape the world, one operation at a time. The public saw the surface. Beneath it, a silent empire was growing. The earliest covert operations were aimed at a single objective: stop the spread of Soviet influence. But as time passed, the mission changed, the boundaries blurred, and soon, the CIA's covert agenda expanded far beyond containing communism. To understand how, we must look at one of the earliest and most controversial operations in CIA history: Operation Paperclip. When Nazi Germany collapsed, many of the most brilliant scientists, engineers, doctors, and intelligence officers did not simply vanish. Their knowledge, especially in rocketry, medicine, chemical experimentation, and psychological manipulation, was considered invaluable. The Soviet Union wanted them, the United States wanted them, and the race for technological supremacy began. The CIA, working with what was then the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, and US Army intelligence began smuggling hundreds of Nazi scientists into the United States, giving them new identities, new citizenship, and new funding. This was not a conspiracy theory. It is now a fully documented historical record, officially declassified in 2010. Among these scientists was Wernher von Braun, who would later become the architect of the American space program and the Apollo missions to the moon. But many of the others had darker histories. Some had conducted inhumane experiments during the war, experiments on prisoners, experiments on children, experiments on psychological breakdown and behavioral control. This knowledge would become the foundation for some of the CIA's most disturbing secret projects. To justify these morally dangerous actions, the US government invoked a phrase that would echo throughout coming decades: for national security. This phrase became the skeleton key for unrestricted power, and the money needed to fund this quiet revolution came from accounts that the public would never see. The black budget grew. By the early 1950s, the CIA had become something entirely new. A secretive agency with its own flight programs, its own weapons, its own laboratories, and an expanding network of officers, informants, and assets in every region of the world. But the agency soon turned its focus towards something even larger: mind control. During the Korean War, US soldiers captured by North Korean and Chinese forces appeared to adopt communist beliefs. Some returned home speaking favorably about their captors. To the US military, this seemed impossible, unthinkable. The fear was that America's enemies had discovered a method of psychological manipulation, a method of controlling human thought. In response, the CIA launched a secret program known as Project Bluebird, which evolved into Project Artichoke, and finally into the infamous MKUltra. The goal of MKUltra was simple but terrifying: to control the human mind, to erase memories, to implant beliefs, to influence behavior without resistance, to reshape human identity. This program was not small, it was not experimental, and it was not symbolic. It involved universities, prisons, hospitals, military installations, and intelligence facilities across the United States and Canada. It used hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, isolation techniques, psychological torture, and chemical substances, including LSD, often administered without the knowledge or consent of the subjects. Some of these subjects were civilians, some were mental health patients, some were American soldiers. The public did not know. Congress did not know. Even the president was not always informed. Funding for MKUltra came through confidential appropriations hidden among larger research bills. Money was moved through front organizations posing as private medical foundations. Grants were issued to universities under false names. The black budget was evolving and expanding. By the mid-1950s, the CIA had begun using covert intervention to alter the course of foreign governments. Iran, Guatemala, Syria, Indonesia, the Congo, Cuba. In nearly every hemisphere, the CIA was shaping political outcomes, sometimes by supporting opposition movements, sometimes by financing coups, and sometimes by removing leaders entirely. One of the earliest and most consequential of these operations took place in Iran in 1953. The Iranian Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, had moved to nationalize the country's oil reserves, which had previously been under British control. The UK feared economic collapse, and the US feared Soviet influence, so the CIA launched Operation Ajax. Through bribery, propaganda, staged protests, and media influence, the CIA engineered unrest. Mossadegh was removed. A new leader, the Shah, was installed. And Iran would be reshaped for decades to come, eventually leading to the 1979 revolution and the geopolitical tensions that continue to shape the Middle East today. Operation Ajax was the first major demonstration of CIA covert power. It was successful, relatively cheap, and entirely hidden from the public. It also created a blueprint that would be repeated across the world. Political influence, manipulated elections, controlled media narratives, regime change, and every step of the way, the black budget paid the bill. The story of the CIA is not merely the story of spies and surveillance. It is the story of a new form of empire, one built not through territory, but through influence. Not through public armies, but through private power. Not through overt declarations, but through the invisible shaping of history. And as the Cold War deepened, the stakes grew even higher. New technologies were developed, new forms of surveillance, new tools of persuasion. The CIA entered the era of satellite reconnaissance, psychological warfare, media control, and economic manipulation. And more money was required, more secrecy, more layers of protection. By the 1960s, the black budget had become institutionalized, a permanent invisible branch of U.S. spending, a financial shadow government. But it was during this same decade that the CIA would face one of the greatest challenges in its history, a moment when secrecy cracked, when suspicion grew, when Americans began to question whether the agency still served the public or something else entirely. That turning point came in 1963, with the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Part 2: Assassinations, Propaganda, and the Machinery of Secrecy. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy stands as one of the most deeply analyzed and emotionally charged events in American history. A moment when the nation froze, when television screens flickered, when disbelief became grief, and grief became suspicion. The official explanation was delivered quickly. A lone gunman acting alone, without assistance, motivated by personal resentment. The case, we were told, was solved. Yet, almost immediately, cracks formed in that narrative. Evidence was incomplete. Key witnesses gave contradictory statements. Files were sealed. And the Warren Commission, tasked with providing the nation with truth, left behind unanswered questions that would echo for generations. To understand why JFK's death became linked to the CIA in public imagination, we need to step back, not into conspiracy speculation, but into documented history. President Kennedy had begun questioning the role and unchecked power of the CIA. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, Kennedy expressed private frustration with the agency's leadership. He dismissed CIA Director Allen Dulles, one of the most influential figures in U.S. intelligence history. And he vowed that he intended to, in his own words, splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. Whether this was political rhetoric or a sincere intent, it represented a direct challenge to an institution that had grown accustomed to operating without limits. When Kennedy was killed, one of the men appointed to investigate the assassination, Allen Dulles, was the very man Kennedy had removed from power. This fact alone deepened public distrust. But the deeper issue was not whether the CIA was responsible. The deeper issue was this: the CIA had expanded to a point where even the President of the United States no longer had full oversight or control. And that reality, the existence of a powerful, unelected agency with its own operational logic, its own networks, and its own funding, became the defining hidden architecture of modern American power. This was not universally known, not publicly acknowledged, not discussed in classrooms or political debates, but under the surface, the machinery of secrecy was growing. During the 1960s, as political tensions rose and cultural revolutions reshaped society, the CIA began redirecting its attention inward, toward controlling perception, information, and belief at home. The most important tool in this effort was the media. In 1967, the CIA's internal communications referenced a program known as Operation Mockingbird, an effort to influence major newspapers, television networks, publishing companies, and individual journalists. The idea was not to force propaganda outward, it was to shape the lens through which Americans viewed the world. The CIA built relationships with respected reporters. Editors were briefed in confidence. Some journalists were recruited directly, others were approached through the American promise of patriotism. The message was simple. What we tell you is not a lie. It is a necessary truth to keep the country safe. And so, the narrative was guided. Stories about CIA failures quietly disappeared. Stories about U.S. intervention abroad were softened. Information that could provoke dissent, challenge foreign policy, or disrupt alliances was filtered. And just like that, the CIA discovered an insight more powerful than any weapon. Controlling information controls reality. The black budget financed these efforts indirectly through grants, shell companies, and private sponsorship networks that disguised their origin. A psychological battlefield had been created. And unlike traditional warfare, the enemy was not an opposing army. The battlefield was the human mind. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the United States found itself deeply entangled in Vietnam. A war that began as an anti-communist containment effort but evolved into a prolonged, morally devastating conflict. Behind the scenes, the CIA was heavily involved, training local militias, interrogating prisoners, conducting covert operations along borders, launching psychological warfare missions, and gathering intelligence that shaped U.S. military strategy. But as the war dragged on and American deaths mounted, public support collapsed. Protests surged, counterculture movements spread, trust in government faded, and once again, the CIA turned inward. This time, the target was not foreign governments, it was American citizens. The CIA launched surveillance programs to monitor activists, students, journalists, civil rights leaders, and musicians. These programs, later revealed under names such as Operation Chaos, violated the agency's charter, which explicitly forbade domestic spying. But the agency justified its actions the same way it always had: national security. They believed that social movements could be influenced by foreign adversaries. Whether this belief was grounded in evidence or paranoia, the result was the same. The American intelligence system turned its attention on the American public, and the black budget paid for it. Then came a moment that shook the foundations of public trust: the release of the Pentagon Papers in 1971. These documents revealed that the government had systematically misled the public about the progress and purpose of the Vietnam War. Confidence in political authority collapsed. Faith in institutions dissolved. People began asking questions. And for the first time in modern history, Congress responded with seriousness. In 1975, a groundbreaking series of investigations began under Senator Frank Church, known as the Church Committee hearings. These hearings exposed the scale of CIA covert operations, including assassination plots against foreign leaders, mind-altering drug experiments, media manipulation, domestic surveillance, illegal intervention in sovereign nations. The American public was stunned. This was the first time the veil had been lifted. But even then, the full truth was not revealed. Key documents were classified, witness testimony was restricted, entire programs were erased from the record under the justification of protecting national security. The Church Committee accomplished something historically important. It proved that the CIA operated beyond oversight and accountability. But it also triggered something else: a strategic evolution. The CIA learned that secrecy was no longer enough. It needed plausible deniability, layers of separation, private contractors, foreign partnerships, disposable intermediaries. The black budget would no longer simply finance operations. It would finance distance. Distance between the CIA and its actions. Distance between the agency and the consequences. Distance between the state and its own hand. This was the beginning of the modern era of covert outsourcing. Nowhere would this new approach become more influential than in the 1980s, during the administration of President Ronald Reagan. The Cold War had entered a new phase. The Soviet Union was weakening economically, but still held nuclear reach and global influence. The Reagan doctrine was simple: support any group willing to resist Soviet expansion. This policy led to a series of proxy conflicts in Afghanistan, in Nicaragua, in Angola, in El Salvador, in Cambodia. The CIA supplied weapons, training, intelligence, and funding to resistance groups, many of whom were not democratic, not stable, and not aligned with American values. Some were paramilitary factions, others were militant religious networks. This was geopolitics reduced to a chessboard. The aim was not to promote freedom. The aim was to exhaust the Soviet Union, to extend its military commitments, and to accelerate its economic decline. But proxy wars cost money, far more money than Congress was willing to approve publicly. And so, the black budget once again became the lifeline. This era produced one of the most notorious scandals in CIA history, the Iran-Contra affair. When Congress refused to authorize funding for anti-communist Contras in Nicaragua, senior U.S. officials orchestrated a covert scheme. They would secretly sell weapons to Iran, despite Iran being officially designated as hostile to U.S. interests, and use the profits to fund the Contras. This was not a conspiracy theory. It was later confirmed by congressional investigations and public testimony. Documents were shredded, files disappeared, witnesses contradicted themselves. Responsibility was scattered across a maze of officials, contractors, intermediaries, and foreign partners. And at the center of the web was the core truth. The CIA had learned how to operate without oversight. The black budget allowed it. The doctrine of national security justified it, and the machinery of secrecy protected it. By the end of the Cold War, the CIA had become something far beyond intelligence gathering. It had become the architect of a global shadow infrastructure, private paramilitary forces, off-the-books weapons, pipelines, psychological influence networks, foreign banking channels, covert corporate alliances. The agency no longer merely observed the world, it shaped it. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the CIA faced a new existential question. If the enemy has fallen, what purpose does the agency now serve? The answer to that question would reshape the world again, and the black budget would grow larger than ever before. Because a new threat, real, perceived, or magnified, was approaching. A threat that would change everything. Terror. Part 3, 9/11, the War on Terror, and the Age of Total Surveillance. The year is 2001. A clear September morning, blue skies across the East Coast, normal commutes, normal lives, nothing unusual. And then everything changes. 2 airplanes strike the World Trade Center towers in New York City. Another crashes into the Pentagon. A 4th falls in Pennsylvania. Smoke rises, sirens echo, screens freeze. The world watches in shock. The United States enters a new era, one defined by fear, urgency, and grief. In the days that follow, President George W. Bush declares a new global war, not against a nation, not against a government, but against a concept: terror. And in that moment, the CIA sees a renewed purpose. The Cold War had ended. The Soviet threat had dissolved. But now, a new enemy had emerged, faceless, hidden, networked, and decentralized. The agency was once again at the center of national survival, and from this moment forward, the black budget would grow to levels beyond anything the world had seen before. In the aftermath of 9/11, Congress and the American public demanded security, immediate, absolute, and unquestioned. Fear overrides caution, trauma overrides skepticism, and in crises, power expands. The CIA, NSA, and Department of Defense were granted extraordinary authority to act without delay, without transparency, and without traditional oversight. Secret detention sites were approved. Untraceable rendition programs expanded. New surveillance technologies were deployed. Data collection systems grew from targeted monitoring to global dragnet. The justification was always the same. If we do not act, more Americans will die. The black budget surged. In 2013, documents leaked by NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden revealed something unprecedented. The United States was not just gathering intelligence abroad. It was collecting data on its own citizens. Emails, phone calls, financial transactions, search history, social networks, biometric records, and more. Programs such as PRISM, X-Keyscore, and Boundless Informant demonstrated how deeply surveillance systems had penetrated civilian life. These programs were not rogue. They were legal, authorized under classified courts, shielded from public debate. The war on terror had become a justification for total information awareness. And the CIA was not merely observing, it was shaping the future of intelligence. Drones, facial recognition, predictive analysis algorithms, private military contractors, covert paramilitary units. War had become remote, violence had become invisible. Accountability had dissolved into statistical abstraction. The battlefield was everywhere and nowhere. As U.S. troops fought in Afghanistan and Iraq, the CIA's influence expanded far beyond traditional espionage. The agency became a strategic architect of modern warfare. It operated training camps, directed drone strike operations, influenced foreign elections, funded local militias, negotiated with warlords, determined who lived and who died, all under classification, all financed by accounts the public would never see. By 2010, the black budget had become so large that when a portion was accidentally leaked in 2013, analysts discovered something astonishing. More money was being spent on hidden intelligence operations than the entire public budgets of most nations. Billions every year without explanation. This is where the question becomes unavoidable. Who does the CIA answer to? Congress? The president? The American people? The official answer is all of the above. The practical truth is more complex. The CIA is embedded in a web of defense contractors, private intelligence firms, multinational corporations, foreign intelligence alliances such as the Five Eyes Network, and classified military commands. Power has become distributed, spread across entities shielded from legal consequence. This does not mean the CIA is omnipotent or universally malicious. It means the CIA has evolved into something structurally unaccountable, a system guided not by one ideology, but by inertia, not by one leader, but by self-preserving momentum, not by transparency, but by secrecy, secrecy justified by fear, fear justified by danger, danger justified by intelligence that cannot be revealed. This cycle is the foundation of the black budget, a structure that continues to grow as long as there is threat. And in the modern world, threat is infinite. One of the most significant developments in the last 2 decades is the rise of private intelligence organizations, companies that perform the same functions once exclusive to national agencies: surveillance, cyber operations, data harvesting, paramilitary training, assassination logistics, influence campaigns. But unlike government agencies, private organizations do not answer to the Constitution. They do not require public justification. They do not face elections. They operate for profit. The CIA collaborates with many of them. Some were founded by former agency personnel. Some act as operational shadows. Some serve as buffers, allowing the U.S. government to deny involvement while still directing outcomes. This is the new structure of power in the 21st century. Government and private intelligence have merged. Public and secret operations have blended. War and commerce have become indistinguishable, and the black budget funds the entire ecosystem. Through Geopolitics today, advanced surveillance systems track global communication in real time. Social media platforms map public psychology. Artificial intelligence predicts behavior and sentiment. Biometric identification systems follow movement across borders and cities. The modern intelligence state is not built on human spies lurking in alleyways. It is built on data, the raw material of identity, the blueprint of daily life. The CIA, NSA, and allied intelligence agencies no longer simply observe the world. They simulate it, model it, predict it, influence it. The battlefield has shifted from territory to perception, from oceans and borders to culture and belief, from physical control to psychological influence. The question is no longer whether the CIA shapes global events. The question is how deeply the agency now shapes reality itself. And so we arrive at the truth hidden beneath decades of operations. The black budget is not just money, it is a permission structure. Permission to act without notice, permission to influence without consent, permission to erase without consequence. It is the silent language of power. Most Americans will never see the ledger. Most will never know the names of those who authorize operations. Most will never learn the full extent of what has already been done. The CIA does not hide everything. It hides just enough. Enough to keep the public calm. Enough to keep trust from collapsing. Enough to ensure belief in the surface story. But beneath that surface, another world operates. A world in which secrecy is stability, control is security, silence is order, and knowledge, full, unfiltered, unmediated knowledge, is the most dangerous threat of all. The story of the CIA is not a story of villains and heroes. It is a story of power. Power gained, power justified, power defended. Born in a moment of global fear, expanded in a century of conflict, maintained through secrecy. The question now is no longer what the CIA has done. The question is, what does it do next? In a world where wars are digital, where truth is negotiable, where surveillance is constant, and where the boundaries between freedom and control blur just enough to go unnoticed, the CIA remains where it has always been, in the shadows, watching, shaping, waiting. And the black budget still flows, hidden from view, but never inactive, because the greatest power in the world is the power no one sees.